He just wanted to save the family inheritance, but ended up trapped in a marriage of convenience with a woman he never imagined loving. Between golden vineyards and cold agreements, small gestures began to reveal a feeling that neither time nor secrets could hide, an unlikely story of love, sacrifice, and new beginnings under the Napa Valley sunset. Get ready, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The golden light of the Californian. Sunset reflected in the windows of the old stone villa. As Robert Winters angrily threw the will onto the solid oak table, the document fell with a muffled sound, as if the paper also felt the weight of the words printed there. "This is absurd. My grandfather cannot control my life even after death." His voice echoed through the empty office as he ran his hands through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration. Outside, the vineyard stretched in perfect rows, framed by the rolling hills of Napa Valley. Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer and executor of the will, maintained an impassive expression in the face of the young heir's outburst. After decades of dealing with the Winters family, nothing surprised him anymore. "Mr. Robert, the conditions are clear. To assume full control of Winters Vineyard, you must marry and conceive an heir within the next 18 months. Otherwise, your cousin Matthew will take over the property." Robert stared at the older man, looking for some sign that this was a bad joke. He found none. He approached the window and observed the empire his grandfather had built over generations. The vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, intertwined with century-old olive trees. The Winters Vineyard wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a history, the essence of the family for more than a century. We're in 2025, not in the last century. Arranged marriages are relics of a time that no longer exists, he protested, tasting the bitter irony. While in New York, he was seen as a brilliant executive, capable of closing million-dollar deals with a calculated smile. Here he was completely out of control. Your grandfather believed that tradition and family are the heart of everything he built. The vineyard has always been managed by married men, with children who understood the value of preserving a legacy, explained Thompson, adjusting his reading glasses. "And I should remind you that your cousin is quite interested in taking over, should you decide that the conditions are unacceptable." Robert felt a stab of anger thinking about Matthew. His cousin had never hidden the envy he felt of the close relationship Robert had with his grandfather, despite the physical distance. Matthew was like a snake, always lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 18 months, Robert repeated, as if trying to digest the impossible deadline. Find someone, marry, and have a child in 18 months. And where exactly am I going to find a woman willing to this kind of arrangement? The lawyer didn't answer. It wasn't his role to solve this dilemma, just to inform the conditions. With a heavy sigh, Robert dismissed the man, needing to be alone, to process the absurd situation he found himself in. When the door closed, he collapsed into the chair that once belonged to his grandfather. The smell of old leather and polished wood brought memories of the summers of his childhood, when he ran through the vineyards, listened to old Winters stories, and dreamed that one day he would continue his work. But then came university in the East Coast, the MBA, and the brilliant finance career that increasingly distanced him from his Californian roots. The last rays of sunlight illuminated his grandfather's portrait on the wall. George Winters smiled discreetly in the photograph, as if he knew exactly the dilemma he would cause his favorite grandson. "What were you thinking, Grandpa?" murmured Robert, staring at those wise and determined eyes that, even in an image, seemed to see through him. The sound of firm footsteps in the stone corridor interrupted his thoughts. Without knocking, a woman entered the office, carrying a folder of documents. She stopped abruptly when she saw him, clearly not expecting to find anyone there. "Sorry, Mr. Winters. I didn't know you were occupying the office." She spoke in perfect English, with a slight local accent. Robert observed her for a moment. Something about her seemed familiar, like a distant memory trying to emerge. Brown hair tied in an unpretentious bun, honey-colored eyes that reflected determination, and a posture that demonstrated confidence despite the evident discomfort of the interruption. "Emma Reed," she introduced herself when she noticed his inquisitive look. "I'm the head winemaker of the vineyard. I worked directly with your grandfather for the last 5 years." The name immediately awakened his memory. Emma Reed, the young prodigy that his grandfather mentioned with such pride in his letters and calls. The local girl who had studied enology in France and returned to revolutionize Winters wines. winning international awards for the vineyard. Of course, Emma. My grandfather talked a lot about you. Robert stood up, extending his hand in a formal gesture. I believe we've never been formally introduced. Your visits to the property always coincided with my absences. Emma accepted the greeting with a firmness that surprised him. Her hands, though delicate, showed signs of daily work with the vines. They weren't the soft hands of someone who just gave orders, but of someone who put their own fingers in the soil. Your grandfather talked a lot about you, too. There was something in her tone that suggested that not everything she had heard was complimentary. I'm sorry for your loss. George was an extraordinary man. Thank you. Robert indicated a chair, inviting her to sit. Did you come to get something from the office? Emma hesitated, as if assessing whether she should share her reasons. Actually, your grandfather asked me to continue a special project we were developing, an experimental wine using fermentation techniques that revive ancient methods. I need the research documents we kept here. Robert felt a pang of guilt. While he built his career on the other side of the country, this woman was here, working side by side with his grandfather, sharing the passion that he himself had abandoned. Feel free. He gestured to the shelves full of folders and books. I believe this office is more yours than mine, considering the time you spent here. Emma studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher if there was irony in his words. Apparently satisfied with what she saw, she went to the shelves and began looking for what she needed. Robert observed her in silence, noting the familiarity with which she navigated the space. There was something magnetic in her precise movements, in the absolute concentration with which she examined each document. It was obvious that her work wasn't just a job. It was a passion. Do you intend to take over the administration of the vineyard? Emma's question cut through the silence like a sharp knife. Robert hesitated. The question now carried a much greater weight after reading the will. That's a complicated question at the moment. Emma found the folder she was looking for and turned to him with an expression that mixed curiosity and apprehension. Your cousin Matthew has been visiting the property frequently in recent weeks. He seems quite confident about the future of the vineyard. I bet he does. Robert couldn't hide the sarcasm. Matthew has always been an expert in counting chickens before they hatch. A slight smile crossed Emma's lips before she could contain it. He's already announced several changes, including the revision of the main team. She made a significant pause. Apparently, my working method is too traditional for his modernized vision of the vineyard. Robert felt a sudden indignation. The idea of Matthew taking control, dismissing talents like Emma and potentially destroying the legacy of quality that his grandfather had built, was unbearable. My grandfather believed that wines tell stories, continued Emma, hugging the folder against her chest as if it were a treasure. Each vintage is a unique chapter, influenced by the sun, the rain, the care with which we cultivate the grapes. Matthew sees only numbers, mass production, aggressive marketing. Robert recognized the gleam of passion in her eyes. The same he saw in his grandfather's eyes when talking about the vineyard. And at that moment, an idea began to form in his mind. An absurd, unthinkable idea, but one that could solve his problem and at the same time preserve the Winters legacy the way his grandfather would want. Emma, he began, carefully measuring his words, do you have dreams beyond working for Winters? Vineyard? The question seemed to catch her by surprise. Why do you ask? Simple curiosity. Robert shrugged, trying to seem casual. My grandfather mentioned that you had your own ambitions. Emma studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much she could reveal. I have a small plot of land north of here, a family inheritance. I dream of starting my own boutique winery someday, producing truly artisanal wines. She paused. But that would require an investment that's still beyond my reach. Robert nodded slowly, the gears of his mind turning rapidly. And how much would it cost to realize that dream? Why are you asking this? Emma narrowed her eyes, suddenly suspicious. Because I might have a proposal that could benefit us both. Robert indicated the chair again. Please, sit down. I have something important to discuss with you. Emma hesitated, but curiosity won over caution. She sat down, carefully placing the folder on her lap, and waited for him to continue. Robert took a deep breath. What he was about to propose was madness. It was manipulative, perhaps even unethical, but at that moment it seemed like his only option. I just discovered that, to officially inherit the vineyard, I need to marry and have a child in the next 18 months. He watched her expression change from curiosity to shock. Otherwise, Matthew takes control of everything. Emma blinked a few times, processing the information. That's archaic. I completely agree, Robert nodded. But it's the condition of the will. And what does that have to do with me? Emma asked, although her tone suggested she was already beginning to understand the direction of the conversation. Robert leaned forward, keeping his eyes fixed on hers. I'm proposing an agreement, a temporary, convenient marriage that fulfills the requirements of the will. In exchange, I fully finance your own winery. You'll have enough capital to transform that land into your dream project. The silence that followed was so heavy that Robert could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. Emma stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and something he couldn't decipher. You're asking me to pretend to be your wife? Her voice came out lower than intended. I'm proposing a strategic partnership, corrected Robert, instinctively resorting to the business language he dominated. A mutually beneficial agreement. You help me preserve my grandfather's legacy, preventing Matthew from taking control, and I make your dream of having your own winery possible. Emma abruptly stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the sky was already darkening, and the first stars were beginning to dot the firmament. Would this include, she hesitated, without completing the sentence. A child? Robert completed, feeling strangely uncomfortable discussing the subject so directly. Eventually, yes. The will is specific about that. Emma turned to face him, crossing her arms defensively. And how exactly do you imagine this would work? We barely know each other. There are modern methods, Robert replied quickly, trying to keep the conversation in practical territory. We wouldn't necessarily need to. He gestured vaguely, suddenly finding himself at a loss for words. A rare sensation for a man accustomed to high-level negotiations. A discreet blush colored Emma's cheeks, but she maintained a steady gaze. And afterwards, when the deadline of the will is fulfilled, what happens? Amicable divorce. You continue with your winery, I with Winters. We share custody of the child. Robert presented the plan as if he were proposing a business merger. Everything made official in a contract, guaranteeing your rights and mine. Emma let out an incredulous laugh. You really think of everything as a business, don't you? Even a child. The criticism hit him harder than expected. I'm trying to find a practical solution to an impossible problem, he defended himself, and offering you the opportunity to fulfill your dream much sooner than would otherwise be possible. Emma sat back down, her fingers thoughtfully drumming on the folder in her lap. How long would I have to pretend? 2 years at most, replied Robert, feeling slight optimism when he realized she was considering the proposal. Time enough to fulfill the requirements of the will and legally establish my right to the vineyard. And the people, what will we tell them? The partial truth. That we met during my previous visits, kept in touch from a distance, and decided to make the relationship official after my grandfather's death. Emma bit her lower lip, thoughtfully. I have some conditions. Robert felt an involuntary smile form. It was exactly as his grandfather described her, determined and objective, never accepting less than she deserved. I'm listening. First, I keep my job as head winemaker with full autonomy. Second, I'll have participation in the administration of the vineyard for as long as our agreement lasts. Third, I want everything documented in writing, including the financing of my future winery. Robert nodded, impressed with her assertiveness. Seems fair. And fourth, Emma continued, her gaze intensifying. No emotional involvement. This is strictly a business agreement. Obviously, Robert agreed, quickly, almost offended by the suggestion that it could be anything else. Purely professional. Emma studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read beyond the words. Finally, she extended her hand. We have a deal, then. Robert shook her hand, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. We have a deal. Their fingers touched. The last ray of sunlight disappeared on the horizon, plunging the office into twilight. Neither of them could imagine how that agreement, sealed in the dusk of an autumn day, would forever transform their lives. The first days after the agreement were marked by an almost painful formality. Robert and Emma behaved like actors on a stage, playing carefully rehearsed roles in front of the vineyard employees and the residents of the small Napa Valley community. They walked together through the vineyards during the day, maintaining a calculated distance, close enough to look like a couple, distant enough to avoid any accidental contact. They dined at the long table in the dining room, separated by meters of polished wood, exchanging only superficial comments about the weather or the harvest. At night, Emma retired to the guest room in the east wing of the villa, while Robert occupied the master suite that once belonged to his grandparents. The property was large enough that they could spend entire days without meeting, if they so wished. A week after the agreement, Robert officially announced the engagement to the vineyard team. The news was received with genuine joy by the older employees, who saw in the union a natural continuation of the Winters legacy. Emma was loved and respected by all, and many considered that George would have approved of the choice. "I always knew there was something between you two," commented Martha, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for more than 3 decades, while serving breakfast. "The way the old mister talked about you both, as if he knew something no one else perceived." Robert and Emma exchanged uncomfortable looks, silently wondering if his grandfather's plan had always been to unite them in this way. The idea seemed absurd, but also strangely plausible, knowing George's strategic and forward-thinking nature. The wedding was set for the following month, time enough to seem decent after the morning, but quick enough not to raise suspicions about the deadline of the will. The ceremony would be small, just for close family and vineyard employees, in the old stone chapel on the property. As the date approached, Robert found himself spending more time with Emma than strictly necessary to maintain appearances. He observed her working in the vineyards, fascinated by the precision with which she examined each vine, by the delicacy with which she tasted the grapes to assess their ideal point. "You really love this, don't you?" he asked one morning, finding her between the rows of vines, with her notebook in hand and the rising sun illuminating her concentrated profile. Emma seemed surprised by the question, or perhaps by the fact that he had ventured so early among the vineyards. "It's not just a job for me," she answered simply. "It's like breathing." "My grandfather used to say something similar," Robert commented, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "That when you find something you love to do, the line between work and pleasure disappears." "And you?" Emma asked, studying him with curiosity. "Did you find that in New York?" The question caught him off guard. Robert hesitated, realizing that he had never really reflected on this. "I found success," he finally answered. "It's not always the same thing as happiness." Emma nodded, as if understanding something profound in his words. "Would you like to learn a bit about the process, since you'll be the official owner of all this soon?" The invitation surprised him, but Robert readily accepted. In the hours that followed, Emma guided him through the secrets of winemaking with patience and passion. She showed him how to evaluate the acidity of the grapes, how to identify the perfect moment for harvesting, how the specific terroir of each parcel of land influenced the character of the wine. Robert, accustomed to learning quickly, found himself a clumsy student in the face of practical knowledge. His hands, used to signing contracts and manipulating spreadsheets, seemed strange and inadequate among the vines. When he tried to cut a bunch of grapes for analysis, he almost cut off a young shoot as well. "No!" Emma exclaimed, firmly holding his wrist. "That way you hurt the plant." Her fingers closed over his, guiding the movement of the pruning shears. "Gently, see? With respect." The sudden contact sent an unexpected current through Robert's arm. For a moment he found himself extremely aware of her proximity, the subtle perfume that emanated from her hair, the warmth of her skin against his, the determination in her eyes. Something in that instant imperceptibly changed between them, like a musical note, almost inaudible, but that alters the entire composition. Emma also seemed to feel the change as she stepped back, releasing his hand. "You'll get the hang of it with practice," she said, her voice slightly lower than normal. "I have an excellent teacher," Robert replied, surprised by the sincerity in his own words. The following days brought a new dynamic. Although they maintained the facade of a relationship for the outside world, something more genuine began to flourish in their private moments. A camaraderie, a complicity that wasn't foreseen in the original agreement. Robert began to wake up earlier, accompanying Emma in her morning routines through the vineyards. She in turn began to join him in the office in the afternoon, helping him understand the administrative aspects of the vineyard that his grandfather had left impeccably organized. On one of those afternoons, while reviewing contracts with distributors, Robert noticed an error that could cost the vineyard a considerable amount. "This isn't right," he murmured, pointing to the numbers. "We're selling below market value to this American importer." Emma leaned over his shoulder to examine the document, so close that he could feel the warmth of her breath. "Matthew negotiated this contract last year, while your grandfather was ill. George never reviewed it." "Typical of my cousin." Robert shook his head, irritated. "He probably received some under-the-table commission. Can we renegotiate?" "Not only can we, but we will," Robert stated, feeling a renewed determination. "This place isn't just a business to be exploited. It's my family's legacy, your life's work, the livelihood of dozens of families." Emma studied him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "You're beginning to sound like your grandfather. Is that a compliment or a criticism?" Robert asked with a half smile. "Definitely a compliment," she replied, returning the smile. "George would be proud." Those words touched Robert more deeply than he was prepared to admit. Emma's silent approval, the parallel with his grandfather, both awakened a feeling of belonging that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The week of the wedding arrived, bringing with it an unexpected anxiety for both. What should have been just a legal formality began to carry an emotional weight that neither had foreseen. Emma spent more time alone in the cellar, immersed in work, as if seeking distraction. Robert, in turn, had become restless, spending hours walking through the olive groves until late at night. On the eve of the ceremony, Robert found Emma sitting alone at the old stone lookout that offered a panoramic view of the vineyards. The moonlight bathed the landscape in silver and shadows, creating an almost dreamlike scenario. "May I join you?" he asked, keeping his voice low so as not to break the tranquility of the moment. Emma silently nodded, moving slightly to give him space on the stone bench. For a few minutes they remained in silence, observing the stars that dotted the Californian sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "Are you nervous?" Robert finally asked. "I shouldn't be," Emma replied, absently running her fingers over the rough surface of the bench. "It's just a contract, right? A formality." "Right," Robert agreed, although something in his tone suggested doubt. Still, Emma hesitated, as if carefully choosing her words. "It seems important somehow, as if we were challenging fate." Robert had never been a man given to philosophical reflections, but something in that moment, the starry night, Emma's proximity, the eve of a step that would change their lives, made him contemplate the weight of their choices. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Emma pondered for a moment. "I believe that life offers us paths, and our choices determine where they lead us. But sometimes," she looked at the vineyards that stretched below them, "sometimes it seems that certain things were written long before we realized it. Like us too here," Robert completed, following her gaze. "Like us too here," she repeated softly, impulsively. Robert extended his hand and covered hers on the stone bench. The gesture was simple, almost innocent, but loaded with a meaning that neither was prepared to fully explore. Emma didn't withdraw her hand. For a long moment, they remained like that, connected by the most basic touch, but somehow more intimate than any word could be. "Tomorrow," Robert finally broke the silence, "when we say the vows, I want you to know that, even though it's part of an agreement, I intend to honor them." Emma turned her face to look at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "And so do I," she replied with a sincerity that surprised him. There, under the starry sky of California, something silently changed between them. Not a promise of love, not yet, but perhaps the recognition of a possibility that neither had considered when they made their agreement. The wedding was simple and intimate, as planned. The old stone chapel of the property, decorated with vines and wildflowers, welcomed only the closest employees of the vineyard and some personal friends of Emma. Robert had no family besides Matthew, who declined the invitation with a dry and professionally polite message. Emma walked down the central aisle, wearing a simple but elegant ivory dress, carrying a small bouquet of lavender and olive, symbols of the land she loved so much. Robert, waiting for her at the improvised altar, felt an unexpected knot in his throat when he saw her approach. There was something surreally right about that image, as if she had always belonged to that scenario. The vows were brief, traditional. When the local priest asked them to exchange the rings, their fingers touched for a moment longer than necessary. Both their "I do's" sounded more sincere than either had planned. When the priest declared them husband and wife, came the moment they had nervously discussed the night before, the kiss. It should be just a quick seal, a formality to authenticate the ceremony. But when Robert leaned in, something changed in the air between them. The kiss, planned to be brief and perfunctory, transformed into something more. It wasn't passionate or theatrical, but there was a gentleness, a tenderness that neither expected. When they separated, both seemed slightly dazed, as if they had experienced something completely unexpected. The small reception that followed was held on the terrace of the villa, overlooking the vineyards. The wines served were, naturally, the best from Winters, including an award-winning red that Emma had developed with George. To the most beautiful bride in Napa Valley, and the lucky man who won her, toasted Anthony, the oldest foreman of the vineyard, raising his glass. George would be radiant today. Robert and Emma exchanged guilty looks upon hearing the sincere words. For a moment, the weight of the farce they were enacting seemed heavier than ever. "Dance!" someone shouted from the small crowd, and soon everyone joined the request. Robert extended his hand to Emma, leading her to the center of the terrace where a small space had been reserved for dancing. The local band began to play a traditional Californian melody, slow and melancholic. "I'm not very good at this," Emma confessed in a low voice when he placed his hand on her waist, pulling her closer. "Neither am I," Robert admitted with a small smile, "but I think we can fake this too." However, when they began to move to the sound of the music, there was no pretense in the way their bodies fit together, in the natural rhythm they found together. Emma followed his steps as if she could anticipate each movement, and Robert guided her with a confidence that surprised them both. "For someone who isn't good at this, you move very well," Emma commented, her voice softer than normal. "I have a great partner," Robert replied, his eyes never leaving hers. When the music ended, they remained for a moment closer than necessary, as if reluctant to break the connection they had established. Around them, the guests applauded, enchanted by what appeared to be a genuinely in-love young couple. As the night progressed and the guests began to say goodbye, the reality of what would follow began to loom over them. The wedding night, an aspect of the agreement they had carefully avoided discussing in detail. When the last guest left and the villa finally quieted, Robert and Emma found themselves alone in the corridor that led to their respective rooms. "Well," Emma began, a slight blush coloring her cheeks, "I think we did it. Officially married." "Yes," Robert agreed, suddenly awkward, like a teenager after the first date. It was a beautiful ceremony. An uncomfortable silence established between them, loaded with unspoken words and unrecognized expectations. "I should..." Emma vaguely indicated the direction of the guest room she had occupied since she arrived. "Of course," Robert nodded quickly. "Good night, then." "Good night," she replied, but didn't move immediately. For a brief moment, it seemed that one of them would say something more, would break the invisible barrier they had built. But the moment passed, and Emma finally turned, walking down the stone corridor. Robert watched her leave, feeling a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. It was better this way, he repeated to himself. The agreement was clear, no emotional involvement. Still, as he entered the master suite alone, he couldn't help but notice how large and empty the bed seemed. The following weeks established a new routine. For the outside world, they were the perfect couple, the Winters heir and the talented winemaker, uniting tradition and innovation to take the vineyard to new heights. In private, they maintained a cordial but distant relationship, each carefully respecting the other's space. However, small changes began to occur, almost imperceptible at first. Emma started to leave a cup of coffee prepared for Robert every morning, exactly as he liked it. Robert, in turn, began to bring wildflowers from the fields to decorate the dining table, noticing how she always smiled when she saw them. At work, they became a surprisingly effective team. Emma revolutionized production methods, while Robert modernized the administration and expanded international markets. Together, they were transforming Winters Vineyard into an even more respected name in the world of wines. It was during this period that Matthew finally reappeared. Without warning, the red sports car crossed the gates of the property on a sunny afternoon, raising a cloud of dust that seemed a harbinger of his arrival. Robert was in the office when Anthony knocked on the door, announcing the unwanted visit. "Your cousin is here, sir. Should I send him in?" With a resigned sigh, Robert nodded. "Yes, please." Matthew entered as he always did, as if the place belonged to him. Tall and slim, with artistically disheveled dark hair and an impeccable Italian suit, he carried arrogance like other men carry expensive watches, ostentatiously and with pride. "Cousin," he exclaimed with false joy, opening his arms dramatically. "What a charming wedding. I deeply regret having missed it." "I'm sure you do," Robert replied dryly, without getting up to greet him. "To what do we owe the pleasure of the visit?" Matthew circled the office, examining George's personal objects as if assessing their value. "Just a courtesy visit, to meet the new Mrs. Winters and congratulate the happy couple." His tone made it clear that he didn't believe in the happiness of the arrangement. "Emma is in the vineyards. I'm sure we'll find her there." As they walked through the corridors of the villa towards the fields, Matthew maintained a monologue about his recent business achievements, implying that he was just waiting for the right moment to take over the vineyard. "You know, cousin," he said with a studied casualness, "some people in town find the speed of your marriage peculiar." So soon after old George's funeral, Robert felt his jaw stiffen. People always talk. It's human nature. Of course, Matthew smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. Still, it's curious how everything fit together so conveniently. The condition of the will, the beautiful winemaker always at hand. "If you have something to say, Matthew, say it directly." Robert stopped walking, facing his cousin. "Just observations, cousin. Just observations." Matthew shrugged, his smile transforming into something more predatory. "But I'm sure the estate lawyers would be interested in investigating more deeply should doubts arise about the authenticity of the relationship." The veiled threat hung in the air between them like a subtle poison. Before Robert could respond, they spotted Emma walking among the vines, notebook in hand, completely absorbed in her work. "Ah, the charming bride," Matthew exclaimed loud enough for her to hear. Emma looked up, and Robert immediately noticed how her posture changed when she saw Matthew, becoming more rigid, defensive. "Matthew," she greeted with a cold nod. "What a surprise. I came to
personally congratulate the newlyweds," he approached, taking her hand and kissing it with exaggerated formality. "And I must say, Emma, that you look even more radiant as a winter." Robert observed the evident discomfort on Emma's face as she
delicately withdrew her hand. An unexpected protective feeling invaded him. "Emma has been doing extraordinary work with this year's harvest," Robert commented, subtly placing himself between her and Matthew. "Critics are already anticipating that it could be the best in the history of the vineyard." "Fascinating," Matthew replied without real interest. "And how's married life? As romantic as it seems?" Robert felt Emma stiffen beside him. Without thinking twice, he put his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "Better than we could have imagined," he replied with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Isn't it, darling?" Emma hesitated for only a fraction of a second before leaning against him, fitting naturally into his embrace. "Absolutely," she agreed, looking at him with a tenderness that, if not for the tension he felt in her body, would seem completely genuine. "How did you meet?" Matthew asked abruptly, like a lawyer trying to catch witnesses in contradiction. "During the summers Robert spent here," Emma replied without hesitation. "I was starting as George's assistant, still a student of enology. We bumped into each other in the old cellar." Robert continued the story, improvising. "Emma gave me a lesson about the importance of temperature and fermentation that I never forgot." "You were bored and impatient," Emma added, a genuine smile forming on her lips. "You thought you already knew everything about wines because your grandfather was George Winters, and you quickly put me in my place." Robert laughed, surprising himself with the ease with which the lie flowed, as if they were really reminiscing, a shared memory. Matthew observed them with narrowed eyes, clearly looking for flaws in the story. "And you kept in touch all these years?" "Letters, mainly," Emma replied. "Robert was always traditional in that aspect." "And calls," added Robert, "especially when I was on business trips. The time difference between New York and California was always challenging." "How romantic," Matthew commented with evident sarcasm. "And when did you decide you were in love?" Robert felt Emma stiffen again at his side. The question was too direct, too dangerous. "Some things can't be explained with words, cousin," Robert replied, turning to look Emma directly in the eyes. "Sometimes you just know." What happened next wasn't in the script they had implicitly established. Robert leaned in and kissed Emma, not the chaste and perfunctory kiss of the ceremony, but something deeper, more real. Their lips met with a surprising familiarity, as if they had done this hundreds of times before. For a moment, Emma remained still, apparently shocked. Then, to Robert's surprise, she responded to the kiss, her fingers intertwining in his hair with a disconcerting naturalness. When they finally separated, both seemed a bit dazed, as if they had been caught by surprise by their own actions. Matthew observed them with a sour expression, clearly uncomfortable with the display of affection. "Well, that certainly clarifies any doubt," he muttered, taking a step back. "I should be going. I have business in San Francisco tonight." "A pity you can't stay for dinner," Robert commented, making no effort to hide his relief. Matthew cast a last, calculating look at the couple. "I'll be observing with interest the development of the Winters family. The will mentions an heir, doesn't it?" "We're aware of the conditions," Robert replied firmly, "and confident they'll be fulfilled within the deadline." When Matthew finally departed, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and tension, Robert and Emma remained side by side among the vines, suddenly aware of the proximity they still maintained. "Sorry about the kiss," Robert was the first to speak, moving slightly away. He was pressing, and it seemed the only way to convince him. Emma nodded, avoiding his gaze. "It was convincing. You were brilliant. The story about how we met, it wasn't entirely invented," Emma confessed, surprising him. "You really did appear in the old cellar during my first summer here. You were bored and impatient, exactly as I described, but I doubt that you remember." Robert stared at her, perplexed. I don't remember," Emma shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "You were focused on other things at that time. Your career in New York, probably." There was something in her tone, not hurt exactly, but a resigned observation, that made Robert feel strangely guilty. How many other things had he ignored, or forgotten while pursuing success on the other side of the country? "We need to be more careful with Matthew," Emma commented, changing the subject. "He clearly suspects something." "Yes," Robert agreed, still disturbed by the previous revelation. "He won't give up easily. What will we do?" Robert sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "We continue with the plan. Maintain appearances. Fulfill the conditions of the will." Emma nodded, her gaze returning to the vines around them. "The agreement," she murmured, as if reminding herself of the purpose of it all. As they walked back to the villa, side by side but not touching, Robert found himself thinking about the kiss, the natural way their lips had met, the unexpectedly right feeling of having Emma in his arms. That wasn't in the contract, wasn't part of the agreement, and for the first time, he wondered if the agreement would be enough to contain what was beginning to flourish between them. The following months brought the harvest season, the most intense and crucial time for any vineyard. The days began before dawn and frequently extended until well after sunset. Every available employee was in the fields, picking the precious bunches of grapes at the exact moment of maturation. For Robert, it was a completely new experience. Although he had grown up visiting the vineyard, he had never actively participated in the harvest. Now, under Emma's guidance, he found himself in the middle of the vineyards, hands stained purple, back sore from constant work, but strangely satisfied with the physical effort. "You're getting the hang of it," Emma commented on a particularly hot afternoon, observing him carefully selecting the ripe bunches. "For a Wall Street man, you're not doing badly. I'm under the guidance of the best," Robert replied with a smile, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "Besides, I discovered there's something deeply satisfying in working with your own hands, creating something real, not just numbers on a screen." Emma studied him for a moment, as if seeing something new in him. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing. That wine is one of the few products you can really feel being born. From the earth to the bottle, from the bottle to the glass, from the glass to the soul." He always had a way with words, Robert smiled nostalgically. "I remember him sitting in that old chair on the porch, telling stories about each vintage as if they were children growing up. I miss him every day," Emma admitted softly. "He was like a father to me. After I lost mine." Robert stopped what he was doing, surprised by the revelation. "I didn't know you had lost your father. It was a long time ago," Emma shrugged, continuing. "To work. I was 16, car accident. That's when my mother sold our small vineyard to survive. George helped us at the time, offered my mother work at the vineyard and promised to teach me everything about wines when I was older. He never told me that," Robert murmured, feeling a pang of sadness for all the stories, all the connections he had missed in his years of absence. "You were busy building your life," Emma replied without judgment. "Not everyone is born with their heart rooted in the land like your grandfather." There was a painful truth in her words that Robert couldn't deny. For years, he had considered the vineyard just as a family property, an asset to be managed, perhaps even sold if the price was right. He had never really understood what it meant to people like Emma. Not just a job, but a home, a family, an extension of herself. "I'm trying to make up for lost time," he finally said. Emma studied him for a long moment, her eyes revealing a mixture of caution and something softer. "Your grandfather always believed you would return, that one day you would understand what this place really means." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Robert wanted to say something, express how his feelings for the vineyard, and for her, were changing, but he was interrupted by Anthony's call from the other side of the vineyard. "Mr. Robert, phone call from America for you. They say it's urgent." With a frustrated sigh, Robert excused himself and headed to the villa. The call was from his old office in New York, an offer to return, take an even higher position, with a salary that would have made his eyes shine just a few months before. As he listened to the tempting promises on the other end of the line, Robert found himself looking out the window, observing the workers in the vineyards. Emma was among them, moving with a natural grace among the vines, giving instructions, checking the quality of the grapes, occasionally laughing at something someone said. "It's a generous proposal," Robert finally replied. "But my life is here, now, in California." When he hung up, he realized that the decision hadn't been difficult. Somehow, in just a few months, the vineyard had become more than an obligation or an inheritance. It had become a home. And Emma, although still separated from him by an agreement of convenience, had become an integral part of that feeling of belonging. The harvest ended 2 weeks later, celebrated with the traditional harvest festival. The entire community gathered in the gardens of the villa to celebrate the success of the vintage. Long tables were arranged under the century-old olive trees, loaded with typical Californian dishes and, naturally, the best winter's wines. Robert and Emma presided over the main celebration side by side as the host couple that everyone expected them to be. For the local residents and vineyard employees, they were the perfect symbol of continuity and tradition. George's grandson and the brilliant winemaker he had trained, united not only by marriage, but by their shared passion for wine. "They really believe in us," Emma commented in a low voice, observing the way the guests looked at them with approval and affection. "Maybe because it's not completely false anymore," Robert replied before he could stop himself. Emma turned to face him, her eyes questioning. "What do you mean?" Robert hesitated, uncertain about how to express what he had been feeling in recent weeks. "I mean that we work well together. The vineyard has never been better, and he paused, searching for the right words. "Have become friends, haven't we? That wasn't in the original agreement." "Friends," Emma repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, I think so." There was something in her tone that Robert couldn't decipher, a slight disappointment, perhaps. But before he could explore the subject, the music began, and they were called to open the dance, as tradition required. This time, when Robert took her in his arms to dance, there was a comfortable familiarity between them. Their bodies moved in natural synchrony, as if they had danced together all their lives. Emma rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, and Robert allowed himself to close his eyes, absorbing the sensation of having her so close. It was during that dance, under the Californian stars and lulled by an old American melody, that Robert finally admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny. He was falling in love with his wife of convenience. The realization hit him with a frightening clarity. Each small moment shared in recent months, the silent morning coffees, the walks among the vineyards, the discussions about wine production, even the occasional disagreements. Everything had accumulated to create something he hadn't foreseen, something that wasn't in the contract. When the music ended, Robert moved slightly away, studying Emma's face as if seeing it for the first time. There was a softness in her eyes as she watched him, a vulnerability she rarely showed. "Emma, he began, but was interrupted by Anthony, who approached with urgency. "Pardon, sir and madam," the foreman apologized, "but we have a problem in the main cellar. One of the fermentation tanks is showing signs of contamination." Emma immediately went into professional mode. "Which tank? Is the temperature stabilized?" "Tank 3, ma'am. The temperature started to rise beyond normal. We need to check immediately." Emma turned to Robert. "It might be nothing, but if it's a bacterial contamination, we could lose all the production from that tank." Robert nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Let's go." They quickly excused themselves to the guests and headed to the modern cellar, where the precious juices from the recent harvest were beginning their process of transformation into wine. The following hours were of intense and concentrated work. Emma, with a competence that Robert increasingly admired, coordinated the team to isolate the problematic tank and save what they could of the precious liquid. Her technical knowledge, combined with an almost supernatural intuition, allowed them to quickly identify the source of the problem, a small failure in the refrigeration system that had allowed a localized increase in temperature. Robert worked at her side without hesitation, following her precise instructions, marveled by the way she transformed a potential crisis into a controlled situation. It was already past midnight when they finally managed to stabilize everything. Most of the employees had been dismissed, leaving only Emma and Robert in the silent cellar, surrounded by the sweet and fermented aroma of the grapes transforming. "You were incredible," Robert commented, watching her check the control panels. "One last time?" Emma smiled, exhausted but visibly relieved. "Years of experience. George always said that a good winemaker needs to feel the wine like they feel their own pulse. He was right. You have a gift." Robert approached, handing her a glass. "I thought we deserved a celebration for the crisis." Averted. Emma accepted the glass, immediately recognizing the wine. Cabernet 2018, the last vintage that your grandfather personally supervised. It seemed appropriate. Robert raised his own glass in a silent toast. They drank in contemplative silence, leaning against one of the huge oak barrels that dominated the cellar. The space around them was illuminated only by the low emergency lights, creating an almost magical, intimate environment. "What were you going to say?" Emma suddenly asked, her voice breaking the silence. "At the party, before we were interrupted?" Robert felt his heart accelerate. The question caught him unprepared, although he should have anticipated it. Now, in the silence of the cellar, with only Emma at his side, the words seemed simultaneously easier and harder to pronounce. "I was going to say that." He hesitated, turning the glass between his fingers, watching the ruby liquid create hypnotic patterns in the dim light. "That things have changed since we made our agreement." Emma watched him attentively, her expression impossible to read in the shadows. "Changed how? When I proposed this arrangement, I saw you only as the solution to a problem. The talented winemaker that my grandfather respected, someone who could help me fulfill the conditions of the will." Robert paused, seeking courage in the wine before continuing. "But now," Emma encouraged him, her voice almost a whisper. "Now I see you, Emma. Really see you. Your dedication, your passion, your strength, the way you know every inch of this land, how you understand each vine as if it were a living being." Robert took a step in her direction. "And I realized that our agreement didn't anticipate what would happen if I fell in love with you." The words hung between them, impossible to retract. Robert anxiously observed Emma's face, trying to decipher her reaction. For a torturous moment, she remained completely still, only her eyes revealing the inner turmoil. "The agreement," she finally spoke, her voice controlled, "explicitly stated, no emotional involvement." "I know," Robert nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. "And if you want to keep things as they are, I'll respect your decision. We'll continue as before. I'll fulfill my part in financing your winery when everything is over." Emma placed her glass on a nearby table, her movements deliberately slow, as if gaining time to organize her thoughts. "When I made that condition," she finally said, "it was because I was afraid of being just a means to an end, of becoming another winter's acquisition." "You were never that to me," Robert protested softly. "No," Emma challenged him, her eyes suddenly intense. "In the beginning, wasn't that exactly what I represented? A convenient solution to your inheritance problem?" Robert couldn't deny it. "In the beginning, yes, but now, how can I know that now is different?" Emma interrupted, crossing her arms defensively. "How can I trust that your feelings are real, and not just part of a convenient narrative that you created for yourself?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Robert realized that he didn't have an easy answer. Nothing he could offer as definitive proof. No guarantee that would completely erase her doubts. And how could he blame her? He himself had proposed a fake relationship based on mutual interest, not on emotions. "I can't prove what I feel," he finally admitted. "I can only show day after day that it's real, that you've become much more to me than part of an agreement." Emma studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see beyond the words to the heart of the man in front of her. "I'm afraid," she finally confessed, her voice more vulnerable than Robert had ever heard. "I'm afraid because I feel something too, something that wasn't planned." The admission sent a wave of hope through Robert's body. He took another step in her direction, reducing the distance between them to just a handspan. "Then perhaps we should revise our agreement," he suggested softly. "To include feelings?" Emma asked, a slight smile forming on her lips. "To include the possibility that this," Robert gestured between them, "might be real. Not just a temporary convenience, but something we want to build together. Emma raised her hand hesitantly, touching his face with a delicacy that made his heart race. "This wasn't in my plans," she murmured. "Falling in love with George's grandson." "Nor in mine," Robert smiled, covering her hand with his. "Falling in love with the woman I married by contract." The absurdity of the situation hit them simultaneously, and both smiled, a genuine shared smile that eased the tension of the moment. "We can go slow," Robert suggested. "Figure this out together, step by step." Emma nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I'd like that." This time, when they kissed, there was no audience to convince, no need to pretend. It was just Emma and Robert, in the quietness of the old cellar, surrounded by the legacy they had sworn to protect, but finding something unexpectedly precious in the process: each other. The kiss was different from all the previous ones, deeper, truer, loaded with unspoken promises and newly discovered possibilities. When they finally separated, both knew that the original agreement had been irrevocably altered, transforming into something that neither had foreseen, but that both now wished to explore. The following weeks brought a subtle but profound transformation in the dynamic between them. What before was a calculated and distant cohabitation now flourished into a genuine relationship, with all the discoveries, adjustments, and small joys that this implied. Emma transferred her things to the master suite, although initially with some hesitation. "It's strange," she confessed on the first night, observing her personal belongings mixed with Robert's. "This room was always George and Eleanor's. I feel as if we're occupying a sacred space." "I believe my grandfather would be happy," Robert replied, embracing her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "He always said these walls hold a century of winter's love. Now we're adding our own story." The transition from a pragmatic agreement to a real relationship brought challenges that neither had anticipated. Small, irritating habits, differences of opinion about how to manage aspects of the vineyard, even discussions about which side of the bed each preferred, all part of the complex puzzle of two independent lives trying to intertwine. On a particularly tense morning, after a discussion about export plans, Emma threw her hands up in frustration. "It was easier when we just had a contract. The rules were clear." Robert couldn't help but smile, despite the tension. "You preferred when we didn't care enough to disagree?" Emma stared at him for a moment. Then her expression softened. "No," she finally admitted. "I prefer this, even with all the complications." November arrived with a damp cold that embraced the vineyards, now stripped of leaves and grapes, revealing the skeletal structure of the twisted vines. The days of intense work in the harvest gave way to a more contemplative rhythm, with Emma carefully supervising the fermentation process and Robert focusing on the strategy for the following year. It was during this calmer period that Emma began to present symptoms that, at first, she attributed to the accumulated fatigue of the harvest season. Morning nausea, unusual fatigue, an unexpected sensitivity to certain aromas in the cellar that had never bothered her before. "You need to rest more," Robert insisted one morning, seeing her return pale from the bathroom. "You worked beyond your limits during the harvest." Emma waved her hand, dismissing his concern. "I'm fine, just a passing malaise." But when the symptoms persisted for 2 weeks, it was Martha, the old housekeeper, who finally expressed the suspicion that was beginning to form in Emma's mind. "When was your last cycle, dear?" she asked casually, while they prepared the dough for homemade bread together, a Sunday tradition that Emma had embraced with enthusiasm. The question made Emma freeze, the flour still in her hands.
She calculated mentally, then feeling a shiver on her spine. It can't be. More to herself. The housekeeper smiled, wisdom of someone who had witnessed that same realization countless
times over decades. Life has its own schedule, regardless of the plans we make. That same afternoon, Emma drove to the pharmacy in the neighboring town, away from the curious eyes of the local residents. She bought 3 different tests, unable to trust just one to confirm something so significant. When Robert returned from a meeting with distributors in San Francisco, he found Emma sitting silently on the porch, observing the sunset tinging the sleeping vineyards with gold and crimson. Her face had an expression that he couldn't decipher, a mixture of astonishment, apprehension, and something that seemed very much like wonder. "Emma," he approached cautiously, concerned with her unusual silence. "Is everything all right?" She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Without words, she extended her hand, revealing the small plastic object she was holding. the pregnancy test with 2 distinctly visible lines. Robert stared at the test for a long moment, his brain slowly processing the meaning of those 2 pink lines. When understanding finally hit him, he felt as if the entire world had suddenly changed axis. The words came out as a reverent whisper. Emma nodded, still unable to verbalize the confirmation. All 3 tests were positive. Robert fell to his knees before her, his hands instinctively finding their way to Emma's belly, still flat, without any visible sign of the life they now knew was growing there. "A baby," he finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. "Our baby." Emma covered his hands with hers, her eyes meeting his with intensity. "This changes everything, Robert." "Yes," he agreed, feeling a dizzying mixture of joy and terror. "Everything." "The agreement," Emma began, hesitant. "Technically, we would be fulfilling the last condition of the will, the heir that your grandfather required." Robert felt a pang of discomfort with the mention of the agreement. In recent weeks, he had almost forgotten that their relationship had begun as a contract. The reality they had built together seemed so genuine, so real, that the calculated origin of it all had become just a distant footnote. "This is more than the will now," he stated firmly, standing up to sit beside her. "Much more." Emma studied his face, as if seeking any sign of doubt or hesitation. "Are you sure? This isn't what you planned when you proposed our arrangement." Robert took her hands between his, facing her with all the sincerity he could gather. "When I made that proposal, I was thinking only of the vineyard, the inheritance. Preventing Matthew from taking control. I was a different man then." "And now?" Emma asked, her voice little more than a whisper. "Now," Robert smiled, feeling a clarity he had never experienced before. "I realized that the true legacy isn't the vines, the lands, or even the winter's name. It's this: family, love, continuity, everything that my grandfather truly valued." Emma let out a sigh that seemed she had been holding for weeks. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "I didn't plan to fall in love with you. I certainly didn't plan a pregnancy. Everything is happening so fast." "I'm scared too," Robert confessed, surprising her with his honesty. "But I've also never been so certain of something in my life. I want to raise this child with you, Emma. I want to build a real life, not based on agreements or conditions, but on choices we make every day." Silent tears began to run down Emma's face. "How can you be so sure? What if it doesn't work out? What if we discover we're not compatible in the long term?" Robert gently wiped her tears with his thumb. "I don't have all the answers. No one does. But I believe in us, in the way we work together, how we complement each other, how we make each other better." Emma closed her eyes, letting his words envelop her like a protective mantle. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze. "Then we do this together," she declared. "Not because a will required it, not because we made an agreement, but because we choose to, because we want to, because we love each other," Robert completed, the words coming naturally, without hesitation. Emma smiled, her face lighting up with a joy that made Robert's heart expand. "Yes," she agreed softly, "because we love each other." That night, as they watched the stars from the same porch where they had shared their first moment of true connection, Robert and Emma began to imagine the future, no longer as a calculated extension of an agreement, but as a shared journey, with all its surprises, challenges, and unexpected joys. The news of the winter's heir's pregnancy spread quickly through the region. Friends, vineyard employees, and local residents came to pay their respects, bringing traditional gifts and blessings for the new member of the family. To everyone's surprise, even Matthew eventually appeared, bringing an elaborate gift and expressing his sincere congratulations with the rehearsed formality of someone fulfilling a social obligation. Whether he was genuinely moved upon meeting the nephew who carried his name or just calculating his next move was impossible to tell. A month after the birth, following the local tradition, Robert and Emma organized a small ceremony to officially present the baby to the vineyard. Carrying little George in her arms, they walked between the rows of vines, occasionally stopping to allow the older employees to bless the child in their own way. At the highest point of the property, where the vineyards met the century-old olive grove, Emma handed the baby to Robert. Following Anthony's instructions, who preserved the oldest traditions of the region, Robert took a small amount of soil between his fingers and gently touched his son's forehead. "So that you always remember where you come from," he recited the words that had been pronounced for generations of winters. "So that your roots are as deep as the vines, and your heart as faithful as the land." Emma watched, silent tears marking her face as little George blinked at the California sun, apparently intrigued by the sensation of soil on his skin.
It was a moment of deep connection, not just between father and son, but between present, past, and future. That night, after the baby finally fell asleep following the long journey of presentations and celebrations, Robert found Emma on the
porch, contemplating the vineyards bathed in moonlight. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her a glass of the special wine they had reserved for this occasion, the last vintage that George Sr. had personally supervised. Emma accepted the glass, her gaze still lost in the silvery landscape, about how it all began.
"The agreement, the conditions, the will." Robert nodded, understanding perfectly. "It seems like another life, doesn't it? Another world. Sometimes I wonder," Emma continued thoughtfully, "if your grandfather somehow foresaw all this. If he knew
that, by forcing us into this initial arrangement, he was planting the seeds of something genuine." Robert considered the possibility, not for the first time. "My grandfather always said that the best wine begins with an apparently simple decision, when to harvest the grape. But that decision is informed by decades of experience, attentive observation, and a deep understanding of the potential of what doesn't yet exist." "Do you think he saw our potential, even before we ourselves?" Robert smiled, embracing her with his free arm. "I think he saw something in both of us, perhaps a complementary quality, a possibility that just needed the right circumstances to flourish." Emma leaned against him, finding the familiar comfort of his body, like a vine that needs the right climate, the proper soil, and the appropriate care. "Exactly," Robert agreed, gently kissing her temple. "And now, look at us, a family, a continued legacy, a love that was born from the most unlikely circumstances." Emma raised her glass, proposing a silent toast. "To George, both grandfather and grandson. To us," Robert added, touching his glass to hers. "To the agreement that transformed into the greatest gift of our lives." As the wine touched their lips, rich, complex, with notes of ripe fruit and aged oak, Robert felt a deep sense of fullness. The flavor seemed to contain all the history of the vineyard, all the generations that had worked this land, now including their own. From the baby's room came the soft sound of George's crying, announcing that their brief moment of tranquility was over. Emma smiled, handing her glass to Robert. "Duty calls," she said, with a lightness that transformed even the sleepless nights into something precious. Robert watched her walk away, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. When he turned to the vineyards once more, he could swear that he saw, for a brief instant, the figure of his grandfather walking among the vines, a satisfied smile on his face, wrinkled by time and wisdom. "Thank you, Grandpa," he murmured to the night, "for everything." The night breeze gently stirred the leaves of the vines, like a nod of recognition. Robert smiled, finishing his wine before following Emma inside. The agreement they had made that autumn afternoon, a year before, had been just the beginning of a much larger story. A story of love, family, and legacy that, like the best winters, vineyard wines would only improve with time. If this story touched your heart, share it. Love, like a good wine, deserves to be savored and celebrated.